Mr. Ford, Mr. Kissinger have continued on with the policies and failures of Richard Nixon. Even the Republican platform has criticized the lack of leadership in Mr. Ford, and they've criticized the foreign policy of this administration. This is one instance where I agree with the Republican platform. I might say this in closing, and that is that as far as foreign policy goes, Mr. Kissinger has been the president of his country. Mr. Ford has shown an absence of leadership and an absence of a grasp of what this country is and what it ought to be. That's got to be changed, and that is one of the major issues in this campaign of 1976.
Harsh words from presidential candidate Jimmy Carter. It was the Democrats' second debate with the Republican president Gerald Ford. October 6, 1976. Jimmy Carter beat President Ford that year, but what happened next might surprise you. They became friends, and they wrote eulogies for each other. You'll hear them both in this episode of C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly. In 1976, Gerald Ford came within 2 percentage points of beating Jimmy Carter. It's actually remarkable the election was that close. Gerald Ford was from the party of the president, Richard Nixon, who resigned. Gerald Ford was the appointed vice president and hadn't been elected president. And during the 1974 elections, Republicans were punished for Watergate and economic decline. Democrats gained 49 seats in the House, 4 in the Senate, and 4 new governorships. On January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter became president. The first 21 words in his inaugural address, his first words as president, were about Gerald Ford.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
And then, on stage, Presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford shook hands. After that, a close friendship developed. They had personal, if not political, similarities. Both served as naval officers, both were men of faith, and both had 3 sons, and then finally, with their 4th child, a daughter. And they both died in late December. Gerald Ford on December 26, 2006, and Jimmy Carter on December 29, 2024. Just before Gerald Ford died, he called Jimmy Carter. It was one of their last conversations. Gerald Ford asked Jimmy Carter, "Would you give the eulogy at my funeral?" Jimmy Carter was surprised and said, "Only if you'll give the eulogy at my funeral, if I go first." On January 2, 2007, Gerald Ford's state funeral was held at the National Cathedral. Jimmy Carter sat next to then Vice President Dick Cheney's wife, Lynn Cheney. But Jimmy Carter did not speak at the National Cathedral. He saved his eulogy for a private service in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Gerald Ford was raised. According to reports, Gerald Ford directed aides to make sure Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were added to the manifest when Air Force One carried his body back to Grand Rapids. Here now, in its entirety, is the eulogy Jimmy Carter delivered on January 3, 2007 at Grace Episcopal Church, where Gerald Ford and Betty Ford were married. And Jimmy Carter opened with a callback to how he opened his 1977 inaugural address, nearly 30 years earlier.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land. Those were the first words I spoke as president. And I still hate to admit that they received more applause than any other words in my inaugural address. You learn a lot about a man when you run against him for president and when you stand in his shoes and assume the responsibilities that he has borne so well. And perhaps even more, after you both lay down the burdens of high office and work together in a nonpartisan spirit of patriotism and service. My staff and my diary notes as I prepared for this eulogy reveal a list of more than 25 different projects on which Jerry and I have shared leadership responsibilities. He and I were both amused by a New Yorker cartoon a couple of years ago. This little boy is looking up at his father, and he says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." Jerry and I frequently agreed that one of the greatest blessings that we had after we left the White House during the last quarter century was the intense personal friendship that bound us together. During our closely contested political campaign, as Don just reminded me, we habitually referred to each other as my distinguished opponent. And for my own benefit while I was president, I kept him fully informed about everything that I did in the domestic or international arena. In fact, he was given a thorough briefing almost every month from the head of my White House staff or my national security advisor. And Jerry never came to the Washington area without being invited to have lunch with me at the White House. We always cherish those memories of now perhaps a long-lost bipartisan interrelationship. Jerry Ford and I shared a lot. We both served in the U.S. Navy. He on battleships, I on submarines, as junior officers. In fact, it was my profession. And we both enjoyed our unexpected promotion to Commander-in-Chief. Each of us had 3 sons, and then our prayers were answered. And we had a daughter. And we both married women who were good-looking, smart, and extremely independent. As president, I relished his sound advice, and he often, although I must say reluctantly, departed from the prevailing opinion of his political party to give me support on some of my most difficult challenges. For many of these, of course, he had helped to lay the foundation, including the Panama Canal treaties, nuclear armaments control with the Soviet Union, normalized diplomatic relations with China, and also the Camp David Accords. In fact, on a helicopter in flight from Camp David back to Washington, President Anwar Sadat, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and I made one telephone call to Gerald Ford to tell him that we had reached peace between Israel and Egypt. President Ford and I also shared a commitment to force the Soviet Union to comply with its promise to respect human rights within the Helsinki Agreement, which gave strength to brave dissidents behind the Iron Curtain and helped to undermine Soviet tyranny from within. Our mutual respect, which I've described, blossomed into a valued personal friendship during our shared trip to attend the funeral of President Anwar Sadat in Egypt. We formed a personal bond while lamenting on the difficulty of unexpectedly defeated candidates trying to raise money to build presidential libraries. That's what bound us together most firmly, I think, for the rest of our days. In the early days of the Carter Center, Jerry joined me as co-chairman in all of our important conferences and projects. And I never declined an opportunity to help him with his own post-presidential plans. We enjoyed each other's private company. And he and I commented often that when we were traveling somewhere in an automobile or airplane, we hated to reach our destination because we enjoyed the private times that we had together. One of our most successful and little-known joint efforts, by the way, was agreeing on how to respond to the literally hundreds of invitations from people who claimed that all the presidents were going to participate in an event. And after a private telephone conversation, we would quickly let them know that at least 2 of us would not be attending. Yesterday on the flight here from Washington, Roger and I were thrilled when one of his sons came to tell us that the greatest gift he received from his father was his faith in Jesus Christ. It is true that Jerry and I shared a common commitment to our religious faith. not just in worshiping the same Savior, but in attempting in our own personal way to achieve reconciliation within our respective denominations. We took to heart the admonition of the Apostle Paul that Christians should not be divided over seemingly important but tangential issues, including sexual preferences and the role of women in the church, things like that. We both felt that Episcopalians, Baptists, and others should live together in harmony within the adequate and common belief that we are saved by the grace of God through our faith in Jesus Christ. That we are saved by the grace of God through our faith in Jesus Christ. One of my proudest moments was at the commemoration of the 200th birthday of the White House, when two noted historians both declared that the Ford-Carter friendship was the most intensely personal between any two presidents in history. This close relationship extended to our spouses, as Betty worked on drug and alcohol abuse and Rosen addressed the challenges of mental illness. And when those two women descended on Washington together, few members of Congress could resist their combined lobbying assault. The four of us learned to love each other. In closing, let me extend on behalf of Rosalind and me and Jack and Chip and Jeffrey and Amy and our 11 grandchildren and one great-grandson, our personal sympathy and love to Betty and Mike and Jack and Steve and Susan and all of your extended family. The tens of thousands of people who lined the highway yesterday and today were expressing this mutual love which we share for President Jerry Ford. I still don't know any better way to express it than the words I used almost exactly 30 years ago. For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he did to heal our land.
Among those sitting in the front row in the Grand Rapids service, Gerald Ford's son, Stephen Ford, which takes us to the present, Jimmy Carter's January 9th, 2025 funeral at the National Cathedral, and closure, the promise that Gerald Ford made to Jimmy Carter and Jimmy Carter made to Gerald Ford to offer eulogies to each other. Here is Gerald Ford's eulogy to Jimmy Carter, delivered by his son, Stephen Ford.
In the twilight of my dad's life, Dad and President Carter spoke by phone, and Dad asked President Carter if he would do a eulogy at Dad's funeral. President Carter graciously agreed, and then he also asked if Dad would deliver a eulogy at President Carter's funeral. Now, Dad was thrilled to agree. After that call, as you can imagine, both of them got off the phone and had a pretty good chuckle, considering which one of them would return in person to deliver that second eulogy. As you know, Dad died in 2006, and President Carter's eulogy continues to bring comfort, smile, laughter, joy, pride to our family. And thus, on behalf of my dad, it's an honor to share Dad's eulogy to his old friend. I can just see my dad getting his yellow legal pad out with his pen and writing this for his beloved friend. By fate of a brief season, Jimmy Carter and I were rivals. But for the many wonderful years that followed, friendship bonded us as no two presidents since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It is said that President Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." Now, since Jimmy has a good decade on me, I'm hedging my bets by entrusting my remembrances of Jimmy to my son, Steve. According to a map, it's a long way between Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Plains, Georgia. But distances have a way of vanishing when measured in values rather than miles. And it was because of our shared values that Jimmy and I respected each other as adversaries, even before we cherished one another as dear friends. Now, this is not to say that Jimmy never got under my skin, but has there ever been a group of politicians that didn't do that to one another? During our 1976 contest, Jimmy knew my political vulnerabilities, and he successfully pointed them out. Now, I didn't like it, but little could I know that the outcome of that 1976 election would bring about one of my deepest and most enduring friendships. In the summer of 1981, the two of us found ourselves together again, this time aboard Air Force One, bound for the funeral of the great peacemaker Anwar Sadat. There's an old line to the effect that two presidents in a room is one too many. Frankly, I wondered how awkward that long flight might be to Cairo, and it was a long flight, but the return trip was not nearly long enough, for it was somewhere over the Atlantic that Jimmy and I forged a friendship that transcends politics. We immediately decided to exercise one of the privileges of a former president, forgetting that either one of us had ever said any harsh words about the other one in the heat of battle. Then we got on to much more enjoyable subjects, discussing our families, our faith, and sharing our experiences in discovering that there is indeed life after the White House. We commiserated over the high cost of building presidential libraries, and the even more regrettable fact that most of that fundraising for these otherwise admirable institutions fell to us personally. On the spot, we agreed to participate in programs at each other's library, beginning with a series of conferences on arms control. And if that wasn't newsworthy enough, we told reporters on the plane that a lasting Middle East peace would require the United States to make tough decisions, like confronting the Palestinian issue directly, thereby building on the work to which President Sadat had literally given his life. It was the first time, but by no means the last time, that our unlikely partnership ruffled feathers in the Washington establishment. Now, honesty and truth-telling were synonymous with the name Jimmy Carter. Those traits were instilled in him by his loving parents, Lillian and Earl Carter, and the strength of his honesty was reinforced by his upbringing in the rural South, poised on the brink of social transformation. He displayed that honesty throughout his life as a naval officer, state legislator, governor, president, and world leader. For Jimmy Carter, honesty was not an aspirational goal. It was part of his very soul. Now, I think Jimmy wrote more books than any former president. Once asked if he really enjoyed writing, he replied with that familiar twinkle in his eye, "It beats picking cotton." But I think he enjoyed writing for another reason. As an author, he was under no pressure to tailor his opinions to some political constituency or potential contributor. Now, both of us had experienced the harsh reality that defeat at the polls can be painful, but we also came to know a more important consequence. Political defeat and writing can also be liberating. If it frees you to discuss topics that aren't necessarily consistent with short-term political popularity. Now, Jimmy learned early on that it was not enough merely to bear witness in a pew on a Sunday morning. Inspired by his faith, he pursued brotherhood across boundaries of nationhood, across boundaries of tradition, across boundaries of caste. In America's urban neighborhoods and in rural villages around the world, he reminded us that Christ had been a carpenter. And in third world villages, he successfully campaigned not for votes, but for the eradication of diseases that shame the developed world as they ravage the undeveloped one. Now, of course, not all of Jimmy's time was spent building houses, eradicating disease, brokering ceasefires, monitoring elections. While Jimmy is probably the only former president to conduct a weekly Bible class, I know for certain he is the only former president to perform a duet of On the Road Again with Willie Nelson. Georgia wasn't just on Jimmy's mind, it was in his blood. However far he traveled, he never forgot where he came home to, or where now, in the end, he would finally come home to. Of the many things Jimmy and I had in common, the most important is this. We both married way above ourselves, way above. With Jimmy, every step of the way was his first lady from Plains. In a life rich with blessings, none was greater for Jimmy than the love he shared with Rosalind and the love the two of them shared with their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Like Jimmy, Rosalind was and is a symbol of American compassion. Like no other First Lady in our history, Rosalind Carter is indeed a true citizen of the world. And she became a beloved friend to my wife Betty and me and to all the Ford family. While the Carter and Ford men were decidedly mixed record when it came to lobbying Congress, Rosalind and Betty were unbeatable in their advocacy for millions of people whom they brought out of the shadows of despair and shame. Now is a time to say goodbye. Our grief comforted with the joy and the thanksgiving of knowing this man, this beloved man, this very special man. He was given the gift of years, and the American people and the people of the world will be forever blessed by his decades of good works. Jimmy Carter's legacy of peace and compassion will remain unique as it is timeless. The entire Ford family, we extend our love to you. and we add our prayers to the prayers of tens of millions of people around the world. May God bless and watch over this good man. May he grant peace to the Carter family as they say goodbye to a man whose life was lived to the fullest, with a faith demonstrated in countless good works, with a mission richly fulfilled, and a soul rewarded with everlasting life. As for myself, Jimmy, I'm looking forward to our reunion. We have much to catch up on. Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome home, old friend.
Of course, amid all this mutual admiration between President Carter and President Ford, maybe we shouldn't bring up Gerald Ford's speech to the 1992 Republican Convention in Houston. Or should we? Well, okay, you're right, we should. We open with harsh words from Jimmy Carter about Gerald Ford from the 1976 debate. We close 16 years later, Gerald Ford addressing the Republican Convention in 1992. It was 15 years after Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, in Ford's words, forged a friendship that transcends politics.
President Carter tells us with some satisfaction that his party has finally returned to where he left off in 1981. Does anyone remember the Carter economic record? Inflation 13%, interest rates 21%. Is that the change Americans want for the next 4 years? Let me take you back 16 years to the 1976 election. It's really not my favorite subject. But there are some things I hope Americans will remember. My opponent was a one-term ex-governor, newcomer to the national scene with virtually no international experience. At this time in 1976, I was 29 percentage points behind in the Harris poll and trailing by 33 points in Gallup's. The economists agreed we were coming out of a recession, but not fast enough to do me much good by November. The Republican Party had torn itself apart and never put itself back together. Nevertheless, we closed the gap to 49.9%, and we almost made it. Close only counts in horseshoes. I lost, Governor Carter won. We got change, all right. But remember, change isn't a magic word that makes everything rosy. Change may get you 13% inflation. Change may get you a 17% home mortgage interest rate. Change may bring risky actions abroad, shaking America's prestige and confounding friend and foe. Change, just for the sake of change, may be a 4-year disaster.
What happened in 1992? Americans did vote for change. They elected another governor from the South, Bill Clinton. And now, a bonus clip. Jimmy Carter outlived Gerald Ford, and Rosalind Carter outlived Betty Ford. On July 12, 2011, a funeral service for Betty Ford was held in Palm Desert, California, at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church. Just like your husband did for his friend, former First Lady Rosalind Carter gave the eulogy for her friend.
Historians have said that our husbands, Jimmy and Jerry, developed a closer relationship than any other presidents after leaving the White House. I think Betty and I had a similar relationship.
Now, a reminder, you can search the C-SPAN video library for the National Cathedral services for Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, and also the Grand Rapids service for Gerald Ford. And a historical footnote. Before Jimmy Carter, the last Democratic president who died was Lyndon Johnson. January 22, 1973. It was less than a month after the death of former President Truman, also a Democrat. And it was 2 days after the second inauguration of Republican President Richard Nixon. President Johnson's Washington, D.C. funeral service was held on January 25, 1973. Setting the scene for NBC News coverage of LBJ's funeral, and also available in the C-SPAN video library, here's Barbara Walters.
The church in which the state funeral for Mr. Johnson will shortly take place is the National City Christian Church. It's about 2 miles from the Capitol building. It's the church where Mr. Johnson attended his last service as president, a service in which he heard a prayer he had written for the occasion. The route of the motorcade from the Capitol is west along Constitution Avenue, then northwest on Pennsylvania Avenue to 14th Street, and finally north on 14th Street to the church at Thomas Circle, and that's at the convergence of Vermont and Massachusetts Avenue. This was President Johnson's favorite church. He felt particularly close to the minister of the church. The service there is expected to last no more than 40 minutes. We're now going to go to the church where Paul Duke is for the beginning of the services.
And, Barbara, the motorcade is now pulling up to the church.
As you heard, President Johnson's state funeral was held at the National City Christian Church, not the National Cathedral. The National Cathedral has been the site of 5 state funerals for presidents: 4 Republicans, Eisenhower, Reagan, Ford, and Bush, and 1 Democrat, Jimmy Carter. That's it for this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly. Thanks for listening. Happy searching. And for our closing music, one more clip from the 1973 Lyndon Johnson funeral. Singing Take My Hand, Precious Lord, legendary opera singer and the first Black American soprano to receive international acclaim from the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, Leontine Price.
Precious Lord, take my